Just a couple of days ago, I was speaking to a friend, and he asked me, he apologized that he wouldn't be able to come to my talk, and he asked me to give a sort of a brief synopsis of what I was going to talk about. So I told him, really, I don't know. I never know in advance. I have to see the audience and feel them out, and then I can work out what I should talk about. So he said, but you're going to talk about modern orthodoxy. How do you define that? So I said, that's one of the traps. In a debate, when you're asked to define something, you get entangled in such a way that you can't get out of it. You get so muddled. You don't start off with definitions. Definitions are traps. So I'm not going to try to define what modern orthodoxy is, although I think that I know what it is for me. But I would say that there are certain characteristics that characterize our understanding, our notion of this generic concept of modern orthodoxy. And that is an orthodoxy which is, on the one hand, totally committed to normative halakha, Jewish law, and on the other hand, is dynamic and is developmental and is willing to face the challenges of change, societal change, and even to be innovative. The Torah is said to be Eitz Chaim hi lamachazikim ba. It's a living tree to those who hold on to it. And a tree has roots, strong roots if it's going to be a good, strong tree. And it has a trunk, and then it has branches, and from the branches come twigs, and they come leaves. And that's how the halakha is. It has its roots in our classical textual sources, whether they be the Torah, whether they be the Talmud, the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, etc. And then there's a trunk, which is the basic pillars of the law, the principles upon which our hermeneutical system is based. But then it branches out in a multitude of different directions because it has to deal with a multitude of different situations. And the branches turn into twigs, and the twigs perhaps grow leaves. And then, as it is now, the beginning of the fall, the leaves fall off. And then new leaves grow. And the new leaves may have a slightly different shape, and they may have a slightly different color, but they're the same genus, but they're new, and they're alive, and they're vibrant. So I think that one of the things that distinguishes, certainly in our generation, between what we would call modern orthodoxy and what we generally, in a, again, somewhat crude fashion, call the Haredi community, the ultra-religious community, is that modern orthodoxy is, as I said, developmental. It sees halakha as a constantly developing entity, and it is willing to face challenges and to innovate. Now, this is something which is very important to understand, because throughout all generations, throughout all halachic history, there have always been changes, and the changes are both horizontal and vertical. They're horizontal in the sense that different areas, different geographic areas, different climatic areas present different types of problems to the halachist. And they're also vertical, and every age produces different societal problems. And in every single age, there have always been challenges which were faced by the great decisors, the great poskim. And they were willing to be innovative, and they were willing to make chidushei Torah being innovative decisions, and they were willing to do so even if there was antagonism, if there was disagreement. Anybody that learns the halakha and the Shulchan Aruch knows that in no single passage is the one single view. Everything is a subject of controversy. So these controversies continue, and they're a machloket l'shem shamayim. They're controversies of a religious and spiritual nature. And there were rules and regulations as to how to make a decision and how to decide between the different opinions. But as I say, in every single generation, whenever there was a new urgent problem, it was faced by the rabbis who sought solutions, where they were not going to be stringent and follow what would appear at first blush to be the letter of the law, but understanding the spirit of the law, find a means of circumventing the strictures in order to make life livable, in order to make the Torah Eitz Chaim, a living organism, and living organisms adjust to climatic changes and adjust to all sorts of changes. They have to take into account that in order to survive, you have to make changes. Now, this was the traditional manner in which halakha functioned. And this is the basis of halachic thinking. In the early 19th century, one of the great authorities in Eastern Europe, in Pressburg, which I guess was Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or the Austro-Roman Empire as it was, the Khatam Sofer, Rav Moshe Sofer, was fighting a battle against the newly emergent reform movement, the Neolog movement, which was undermining classical halakha by doing away with customs, minhagim, which don't really have a biblical source or rabbinic source, by reinterpreting biblical verses in a non-rabbinic fashion, and therefore eroding the authority of the classical halakha, normative halakha as it was known. And he, in his struggle against him, regarded these reformers as innovators, mechadshim. He called them mechadshim. And he coined, or he quoted, a phrase which became very, very famous, Chadash asur min haTorah. Innovation is forbidden by biblical law. Now, the original meaning of that particular phrase comes from a totally different area. It comes from the area of agricultural activities in the time of the Second Temple, or the time of the Temple, where you were not allowed to eat of a new harvest before a new harvest, that's Chadash, before the Omer sacrifice was brought during the Pesach period. And Chadash, asur min haTorah. Chadash, the new harvest, was forbidden until you did certain things. He extended the use of that phrase to refer to all types of innovation. And he said that any type of innovation is absolutely asur, betachlita isur. For instance, the reform movement at that time, Germany, Hungary, moved the bima of in the synagogue closer to the Aron Kodesh to make the architectonic structure of a synagogue closer to a church. He said that moving it from the center is asur min haTorah. They introduced clerical gowns, again, to make it closer to their Christian neighbors. He said, it's forbidden by biblical law. Forbidden by biblical law to wear a different type of garment. They introduced vernacular into the synagogue service. vernacular meaning German or Hungarian or whichever language they were speaking in that particular area, as part of the service. He said the Asur min Torah. So he, in his very specific struggle against the Reform movement, coined this phrase and argued it very, very powerfully, and his influence was immense. And his Talmidim, his children and his grandchildren, the Khatam Sofer, the Khatan Sofer, the Shevet Sofer, the Maramshif, the Maramshik, etc., all followed in his footsteps, expanding in every single generation the notion that innovation is forbidden. Now let me give you just a couple of examples of the reductio ad absurdum of this particular notion. Recently, a fine scholar published 2 volumes of the customs of the Arba Kehilot, the 4 congregations of Mattersdorf, Unsdorf, and 2 other congregations in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Hungary, Romania, northern Romania. In those areas, the synagogues had never had heating. It may be because many of the synagogues were wooden and they thought it was dangerous. But in the winter, it was enormously cold. And there are descriptions of the rabbi coming with his beard encrusted in ice. And it was very difficult to get a minyan in the morning unless you paid people to come because it was just too cold. So somebody suggested to the Vad HaKeilah, the committee of all these 4 kehilot, that they introduce heating into the synagogue. But the committee said, Chadash asur min Torah. Our fathers and our forefathers didn't have heating in the synagogues, you won't either. Similarly, in their synagogues, they didn't have seating. The people used to stand in front of a stender and daven that way. On Yom Kippur, people would stay in the synagogue for 24 hours. They didn't have a hafsaka in the middle where you went to after Musaf or Mincha and have a rest and then come back for Ne'ilah. And they had to stand up for the whole time because there were no seats. And some of the people were old and elderly, and it's not easy to stand even for a few hours, and certainly not for 24 hours. So somebody made the very brilliant suggestion of putting in benches. And the Kehillah said no. Chadash asur min Torah. Our forefathers never had benches, you're not going to have benches. So this, of course, is something which is absurd. And the Khatam Sofer had never dreamt that his statement would reach such a degree of absurdity. But this became the heritage of the Khatam Sofer, and the heritage of the Khatam Sofer and of his followers was one in which one makes no changes. One does not innovate. And furthermore, when there's something which is problematic, you don't rule leniently, you rule stringently. If you're not sure of something, then say it's asur, it's forbidden. And this is the situation that actually exists in present-day Haredi communities. And again, let me give you an example. I mentioned the fact that Rav Kook refined the heter mechira, the way of selling the land, the arable land of Eretz Yisrael, to a non-Jew in order to get by the problems which were presented by the sabbatical year. This was done from the time of Rav Kook until the last sabbatical year, which was perhaps 4 years ago, 3 years ago. The rabbinate would always sell the land actually to a Druzi, not to a Christian, but to a Druz, because they were sure he would give it back. And for the first time in the last sabbatical year, the Haredi establishment, which was run by the Mo'etzat Gedolei HaTorah, which at that time was Rav Shach and Rabbi Yoshev, Zichronam Livracha, decided that what was good for Rav Kook is not good for us. We can't sell the land, you have to keep Shemitah. What it's going to do to the economy of the country doesn't bother us. We'll get money from Chutz La'aretz. You people are going to pay for us. You'll give us donations. We'll survive. For the first time, the Rabbanut didn't carry out, this was done by the Rabbanut, actually by the Ministry of Religion and the Ministry of the Interior. But the political parties in Israel, Agudat Yisrael, Degel, etc., were so powerful since they have, the casting vote in our complex coalition government structure, that the Rabbanut was not able to do it. There was an uproar, and finally a solution was found that the Rabbanut wouldn't do it, but the Rav of Tnuva would do it. Well, Tnuva is a big agricultural monopoly, so they did it and they solved it. Many of the Rabbanei Ha'arim, many of the rabbis of the chief rabbis of the different cities didn't accept it, and therefore they weren't willing to give hechsherim to the restaurants, to the shops, etc., that based themselves on the heter mechira. So you can see that there was a complete shift, a shift where they, instead of accepting the ruling of one of the great authorities that had been functioning for almost 100 years, they rejected it because they knew better. Because they still saw this as an innovation which is Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. Rav Kook, Zatzal, in his various writings, sought to counteract this whole movement which basically leads to a calcification or a petrification of halakha. If you can't innovate, if you can't make changes, if whenever you have a problem you always say asur and not mutar, then you really can't function as a society. So he coined a beautiful phrase. And the phrase was, and I'll say it in Hebrew and translate it, Hayashan yitchadesh v'hachadash yitkadesh. That which is old will be renewed, will be revivified, and the new, the innovative, will be sanctified. Now this was the exact diametric opposite to Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. He went further and he made a very important halachic statement. He said as follows, and again I quote in Hebrew and I'll translate, because the formulation is so succinct. He said, Ein isur lahatir et hamutar, af al pi shelo nahagu kein be'avar. There is no prohibition to permit that which is permitted, even if it was not practiced in the past. There was a view that things which were not practiced in the past became, as it were, a minhag, a custom, and therefore achieved a certain degree of authority, of sanctity. He said, no, the fact that it wasn't done for historical or social reasons, if you can't find a reason that it should be prohibited, it's not prohibited. This again is something which is diametrically opposed to what's happening in our Haredi community. There, anything that was not done is forbidden. It doesn't matter if you don't have to look for a reason for it to be forbidden. The mere fact that it hadn't happened in the past means that that is our tradition. Our tradition is not to do. Now, society has changed. All sorts of things have happened. One of the most obvious examples, I guess, that you're all fully aware of and you should be keenly aware of is the change that has taken place over the last 100 years in the status of women. It's not that long ago that women were not allowed to be doctors. In the medieval times, they could be witch doctors, and they were witch doctors, and then later on they were burnt because they were witch doctors. But it was only in the 50s that women of the last century that women were permitted to go to medical school. Women weren't allowed to study to be lawyers. The suffragette movement, which begins in England, let's say, in the 1920s and begins in the late 19th century, became more and more effective. Women were given a vote. It should be borne in mind that halachic authorities were very loath to permit women to have a vote. Over the past few decades, in our own time, we've seen a complete change. In Israel, there are thousands of young women who learn Torah. They learn halakha. They learn Gemara. This didn't happen 40 years ago. And indeed, we have To'anot Rabbaniyot, women who go to the religious courts system as sort of pleaders. We have Yoatzot, Hilchatiyot, women who are willing to give halachic advice in certain specific areas. This is a change that's taking place. And they feel that there's no reason that they should be excluded from many of the areas which had been monopolized by the male gender. And we have a development, which you all know about, I'm sure, of what are called partnership minyanim, in which women are now taking a much more active role in the synagogue service. Parts of the tefillah itself are being led by women, those parts which are permissible to do so. They can get aliyot la Torah. They can read in the Torah certain parts of the Parshat HaShavua. And I'm sure you've all heard of Shira Chadasha in Jerusalem, which is overflowing, and Darchei Noam, which is very close to here, which I believe over Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur had over 400 people. So you can see that these type of innovations, if they're permissible, and if it can be shown based on a careful examination of rabbinic sources, that these are dvarim hamutarim, these are permissible things, there's no reason to say that they should be asur. It's only the modern Orthodox establishment that's willing to condone and to accept and support these types of changes that are taking place in our society. They've been completely rejected by our more ultra-Orthodox brethren. And not just ultra-Orthodox brethren, because the rabbinic establishments, both in Israel and in the United States, have basically been kidnapped by the ultra-Orthodox authorities, the Gedolim, whether it's the Moitzah Gedolei HaTorah or whether it's the Gedolim of America. And the so-called modern Orthodox rabbis do not have the self-confidence to be able to stand up to the criticism that's being laid against them by their ultra-Orthodox counterparts. And this has had a very deleterious effect. And those of you that have been following the fairly recent events that have taken place in the question of conversion, which are absolutely shocking, where the Supreme Court in Israel came out with a ruling that was absolutely disastrous, retroactively cancelling thousands of conversions and turning families who've been for 10 years practicing Judaism in a full manner and had children and wives, etc., and suddenly on Erev Shabbat declaring them goyim and shiksas. Can you imagine what that means? And then this sort of spilt over into the United States, and they started making a very limited number of batei din that were permitted to carry out conversions. And you have synagogues on the Upper West Side that used to have their own batei din and now can no longer do, and on the Upper East Side, and are no longer able to do so because they're not on the list. One can give so many examples of what is going on in this Kulturkampf, in this cultural battle between those who are willing to follow classical halakha, which is based on chidushei Torah, the innovation of Torah, and on the principle, which is a basic principle in halakha, koach dehetera adif. Leniency is in all cases a more positive direction to take if it's halachically possible. Whereas they seem to rule that chumrah adif, that the stringent position is more acceptable. In any case, it's more practiced. People, rabbis, that are presented with problems, real halachic problems, that are difficult to solve, the easy way out is to say, "Ze asur." It's forbidden. Let's avoid dealing with the issue. That is exactly the opposite of what is written in all our rabbinic codes. A person must struggle to find an equitable, livable, humane solution within the parameters of classical halakha to such problems. Perhaps the most shocking example, which you're all aware of, is the aguna problem, the so-called enchained women. Because there's no question that the halachic solutions exist that would solve 95, 99% of all the aguna problems, of all the mesuravot get problems. The problem is not a halachic one. The problem is a sociological one. The problem is that the batei din are not willing to use the kelim, the means which are at their fingertips in order to solve these problems. And the problem, the solutions are there. They're in the Shulchan Aruch. Let me give you another example. When we talk about Giyur, why is it so difficult? The Rambam writes that a conversion can take place before Shalosh Hedyotot, 3 laymen. You don't need rabbis, you don't need a Beit Din, you need 3 laymen. And what do you demand from the person that's being converted? Melamdim oto miktsat halachot kalot umiktsat halachot kashot. A few easy laws and a few difficult ones to ease him in. And then you bring him before Shalosh Hedyotot, 3 laymen, and they convert him. in the process of conversion, and then he's a Jew l'chol davar. And then he has to continue to learn. And then he has, but you don't teach him everything, and you don't demand from him everything. And if lo aleinu, he afterwards doesn't keep to the laws, אף על פי שסרח, הרי הוא יהודי לכל דבר, ומשיבים לו אבדתו. There's a law, a biblical law, that if somebody loses something, you have to give it back to him. That's called hashavat avedah. There's a difference between the status of a Jew and the status of a Gentile. A Jew who was converted but is not a Shomer Shabbat, let's say, or Shomeret Shabbat, is still a Jew. And you have to regard them as such. This whole notion of retroactive cancellation is anti-halachic, anti-Maimonidean, anti-Shulchan Aruch. And just think of what it means. It means that a genuine person that wants to become converted can never be sure of his own future, because in 5 or 10 years' time, some Beit Din for some reason will say, no, we're going to cancel it retroactively. Modern Orthodoxy, what I believe should be modern Orthodoxy, cannot countenance such a type of attitude. It has to follow halakha the way it's written in the sources. It has to follow the basic principles of halakha, which are koach dehetera adif. You should seek ways of leniency. That the Torah is an eitz chaim, it's a livable organ, a vibrant, live organism which is dynamic. And the halakha states the dracheha darchei noam, not just the congregation, but the halakha is that the Torah and the halakha are ways of pleasantness. And this we'll find throughout halachic, many examples within the areas of halakha. So our religion has to be pleasant, it has to be humane, it has to take into account how to be attractive, it has to be inclusive. And if we don't do these things, we're just driving people out of the Orthodox fold. And when we drive them out of the Orthodox fold, we don't know where they'll go to. Here in the United States, you have enough problems of intermarriage. We don't have to exacerbate the situation. So I believe very strongly that true orthodoxy is an orthodoxy that regards halakha as a system of law that was not petrified 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, or even 150 years ago, but is something which is constantly growing, constantly reevaluating the situation, constantly readapting itself to changes in society. And if changes in the past were slow, in our age, changes are very rapid. And I don't know, iPhone number 5 was produced, what, a year or less after number 4? I mean, that's the sort of rapidity of change that's taking place. So we can't say, let's wait and see what happens. You have to run in order to keep up with the time. It's like when you're going on an elevator that's going up. If you stand still, you'll go down. We have to run to keep up with it. And that only we can do. And in order to do that, our constituencies have to give support to those rabbis that have the courage to stand independently against the criticism of their Haredi counterparts. They can't do it by themselves. They need the support of the community. This community has to be aware of the problems. The rabbis have to have the courage to take a position, to explain it to their communities, and the communities have to give them the backing that they need. The halakha was not given merely to the Haredi Gedolim. They do not have a monopoly on psak halakha. We have many Gedolim among ourselves. We don't recognize them sufficiently. And because we tend to be individualists and not to accept the authority of somebody else, we have to work out everything for ourselves, we're fragmented. In certain issues, we have to get together and we have to coalesce. We have to unify ourselves. And only in doing so will we be able to להחזיר עטרה ליושנה, to return the true face of halakha to its traditional visage, manner. Toda rabba. The question was, can you have women rabbis? Again, that's a good question because it has to be analyzed into its component parts. The first thing is, what is a rabbi? A rabbi is somebody who has smicha. But smicha, ordination, is not really smicha. Smicha was ended in about 350 of the Common Era. There wasn't a continuous ordination of an ordained person to another, to his disciples. And nowadays, ordination or smicha is basically a transcript. It's like a degree. You study, and you're tested, and you're examined by somebody who has authority, and if he finds that you know your material, he'll write you a document, which is a sort of a transcript or a sort of a degree, a klaf. That's what a rabbi is a guy that's studied, learned, been examined by somebody who is a rabbi, who studied and learned and got ordination from somebody else. And that's the nature of the authority. Now, what gives the person that has this piece of paper, this paper qualification, authority? It's not the paper that gives him authority. It's the fact that he may be accepted by his congregation. Or nowadays, you have a sort of trade union like the RCA, and they invest their people, their alumni, with this authority, and the congregations are willing to cede their own authority to the organization, to the political organization, which, as I say, is a sort of a trade union. So instead of making their own determination, they say, well, if the guys over there say he's okay, he's okay. But ultimately, the authority of a rabbi in our days is authority that comes from the tzibur, from the community. And therefore, we have some communities which will accept some rabbis and some communities which won't. And we have some political entities which will accept ordination from one institution, but not from another. So that's the first thing to take into account, that the authority is not an authority that really comes from above, that's the real smicha, but an authority that comes from the grassroots, from the kahila. Now, the second thing is, to what extent is a person allowed to act as a judge? And a rabbi basically is a judge. Besides being a spiritual mentor, he has to answer questions and give determinations. And there's a principle, ein eid na'aseh dayan, a witness cannot become a judge. This is a rabbinic statement that's learned from biblical verses. And women, it's generally thought, are not permitted according to Jewish law to give testimony. And if they cannot be witnesses, they cannot be judges. And if they cannot be judges, they cannot be rabbis. Therefore, yok rabbis for women. However, there are something like 12 different types, categories of testimony, of eidut in Jewish law. Most of them are permissible to women. Some of them are not. So in all those areas which are permissible, in the areas of eidut, a woman could also act as a judge. So it means that they don't have unlimited authority, but they have authority in a broad spectrum of Jewish laws. So and we know from the Tanakh that Devorah HaNeviah was a judge. And this is something that's always discussed in the rabbinic sources. How was she a judge? If she's a woman, she was a rabbi. Devorah HaNeviah was a rabbi. So we have even a precedent. And Bruria gave halachic determinations, the wife of Rabbi Meir, and Yalta, the wife of Rab Nachman. They were rabbis, basically. They didn't have that title. So if a congregation is willing to accept, if a woman studies Torah and is examined by a responsible authority, and he's willing to attest in writing to her competence in certain areas, and you probably know that there are different types of degrees, like there's a BA, an MA, and a doctorate. So that similarly, there's Yoreh, Yadin, Yadin, Yerav B'Yisrael. There are different formula for rabbinic ordination. So if after being examined, this woman is found competent in whichever area she's specialized, and she's given a document, and that document is signed by 1 or 3 authorities, and the community is willing to accept her authority, then she can serve that community in various areas of rabbinic activity. Not in all, but in most. And I would add that the only other argument against this, normally presented against the idea of a woman rabbi, is a passage in the Rambam that seems to suggest that women are not allowed to have authority over men. But here, they do not have authority of their own. Here they are vested with the authority by the community. And therefore, even the Rambam over there would agree that his caveats would not be relevant. So, simply speaking, there will be a time, it's beginning, it's happening, when there will be women. Originally, they'll be given different titles. It's a problem what sort of title they'll get. Whether they'll be interns, or whether they'll be educational directors, or whether they'll be spiritual directors, or whether they'll be Marathi, etc. There will be more and more women in rabbinic authority in the Orthodox, in the modern Orthodox framework. That's a question that's always raised. What are your red lines? What are your gvulot? What are your boundaries? And I always answer that that is a trick question, it's a trap, because it's a generic question. Because in halakha, we don't deal with generic questions, we deal with specific questions. And if you were to ask me a question on a specific issue, I would try to research the sources and find out what are the gvulot. Now, the fact that we can nowadays find areas in which we can practice leniency and innovation and reach a situation which looks very similar to what is going on in the conservative movement, such as partnership minyanim, does not mean that we're doing the wrong thing. Maybe what they did 60 years ago was beseder gamur. The fact that it was done by a conservative doesn't mean that it's automatically pasul. So we will have to judge ourselves on our own criteria. And the fact that it may look as though we're nearing conservative practice should not prevent us from coming to conclusions which we see as halachically legitimate.
In the technological society that has evolved in these last few years, given your comment about the iPhone 4 and 5, so we have an issue of a whole generation growing up that is having difficulty on Shabbat detaching themselves from their technology, and the whole evolution of what this technology really does and is from an Isur Malacha point of view on Shabbat, in terms of imaging on things like electronic readers and so on. Do you foresee a time where the traditional Isur Malacha on Shabbat for fire and Malacha would be evolved in a way that some of these things might find a role on Shabbat?
Well, I think you probably know better than me. I don't understand technology at all. But originally, when electricity was developed in the 19th century, it was understood that it was the same as fire. It was hot and it had light. And then as people began to understand that it's not quite so simple, and nowadays there are batteries which are not hot, and there are electrical currents which don't give light, so it became more problematic. And they knew that it was asur, but they didn't know why. So the Chazon Ish came up with this chidush, chadash, asur min haTorah, that electricity, the isur of electricity is mishum boneh, it's the construction of a circuit. I'm told by people that are scientists, and I don't know myself, that scientifically this is not really correct. You don't build a circuit, the circuit exists, and so on and so forth. But I have it on good authority, which I don't understand. So I think that all sorts of things can be done and could be done, and probably will be done, but I'm not sure that it's going to enhance the nature of Shabbat. And I think that with all my tendency to try to be lenient and to be innovative, there are certain things which are not necessarily strictly halachic, but they're meta-halachic, which are no less important and which have to be preserved. And Shabbat is a time when, well, I'll put it very simply, if we're talking in strictly halachic terms, when uvdin dechol are not permitted. And so, from a simplest halachic point of view, I would say that the sort of things that you're talking about, walking around all the time with a BlackBerry and with your thumb all the time working non-stop, and so on and so forth, is something which is uvdin dechol. It's something which is a part of your mundane, non-sacred life, and therefore is not permitted on Shabbat. I know that you could put a television on a Shabbos clock and you could watch football or whatever you people in the United States watch. And you wouldn't be doing anything that's overtly asur, but you certainly would be desecrating the Shabbat.
My question is also a sociological one about your own observations about your colleagues. Perhaps we can understand why members of the laity are impressed by what may be objectively called excessive piety on the part of a rabbi. My question to Rav is, on what basis would other rabbis, rabbanim, who are not Reishayim, but why would they respect piety, and that's what they would aspire to, as opposed to respecting those with greater scholarship, even if they are reflecting part of that?
I'm not sure of what you're really saying. I don't really think that the Haredi Gdolim are necessarily more pious. I don't think they have greater piety. I was absolutely shocked when I read in the eulogies of the late Rebbe Yoshiv that he didn't go to his daughter's wedding, he didn't go to his grandchildren's Brit Milah, because he was learning all the time. He wouldn't stop learning. Yomam v'layla. This was written in the eulogies as a positive thing. I thought it was shocking. What sort of piety is that when you don't relate to your own family? The Gemara discusses a certain passage, the Midrash discusses a certain passage in which it seems to suggest that there's a tzaddik tov and a tzaddik ra. It's rasha tov and a rasha ra. And the Midrash says, what does it mean a tzaddik ra? So he says, a tzaddik tov is a tzaddik shetov labore v'tov labriot. Good towards his maker and good towards his neighbors. A tzaddik ra is somebody who's tov labore v'ra labriot. He's good towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but he pays no attention to his immediate neighbors. So there's a mistake in equating frumkeit with piety. And Rabbi Rav Lichtenstein recently wrote an article in which he wrote, frumkeit is not piety. So the basis of your question is one which I can't accept. The question is the acceptance of the gay community in the modern Orthodox community. I will, again, all questions have to be analyzed. So, first of all, the gay community consists of homos and lesbians. And the halachic status of a homosexual is different to that of a lesbian. This you should know. A homosexual is transgressing a biblical law, which is clearly stated in the Torah. A lesbian is not. It may be the Rabbanan, it's not very clear. So that's the first question to analyze. The second is, what is forbidden to a homosexual? Two males can have a very positive spiritual relationship. They can have a very positive emotional relationship. And there's nothing wrong with that. David and Jonathan, not according to some interpreters. But they're not allowed to have sexual union. Again, that is something that is defined in the halakha. So, for an Orthodox gay person, homosexual, and there are such, and there are communities of such, who are find themselves in a tragic situation where they cannot form a relationship with a person of the opposite sex, but only with a person of same sex, they can make a decision, which is very difficult, to have an emotional relationship which is not a sexual relationship. And they will not be transgressing any law, Jewish law. They can also say, it's too difficult for me. It's something that I can't control. It's something that I did not bring upon myself. I'm not to blame for it. So we all sin in certain areas. None of us are perfect. This is going to be my area of sin. And we can only have deep sympathy for a person of that nature. From a point of view of the community, that person should be accepted fully within the community. He should be given an aliyah Torah. He can certainly make up a minyan. He can be welcomed in the community. There's a technical question of whether he can be a chazan, a shaliach tzibur, because a shaliach tzibur has to be mekubal ala kehila. He has to be accepted. Certain members of the community might not be able to have the strength to do so. So I think that one has to appreciate the tremendously tragic burden that an Orthodox homosexual and lesbian is saddled with for the rest of their life. And I think we have to have a deep degree of sympathy for them. I think we have to welcome them in every way we can, make them feel at home. I think it's advisable that they don't flaunt their particular proliferes. But I don't think that they should be in any way ostracized from the community.
Our tremendous gratitude to Rabbi Sperber.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.